How's everyone doing tonight? Good? Alhamdulillah. Well, it's great to have this opportunity to discuss, to draw some attention to the world of Islamic manuscripts and libraries. I remember the first time I heard about manuscripts in Islamic libraries, it seemed to be something very exotic, very rare, and something that people with very specialized skills go behind closed doors in elite universities and pour through some ancient texts, come with some far-reaching discoveries. And though that may be true in some cases, what that also did was to sort of give the idea that manuscripts are something very distant, very disconnected from ourselves, from our lives, from even our practice as Muslims, our knowledge of Islam. Manuscripts belong to another world that has gone past and has no more importance for us. And what I would like to sort of start off this discussion, and it's a very grand topic, I'll only be sort of discussing a few features, some basics of from the world of Islamic manuscripts, hopefully to familiarize yourself with some of the basic ideas, concepts, the history, and to, inshallah, ultimately light a fire within you, hopefully, to sort of be passionate about Islamic manuscripts. So I want to begin with the sort of basic question to think about, which is, how do we know what early Muslims from the beginning of the Islamic community wrote about Islam? How do we know what they wrote? When you take all the scholars, early scholars, it could be Imam Ghazali, it could be the four Imams of the four madhabs, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi'i, so forth, to Imam Suyuti, to Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, any of these big names that we know of, that we hear about, Imam Bukhari, the books of Hadith, so forth, how do we know what they wrote? And how do we access what they actually wrote? And so what we do nowadays is we could go online, download a PDF, or we can, if we're more traditional, we can go to a bookstore, to Jabir bookstore or to Al-Baragh bookstore, and try to access a physical book, right? But then the question becomes, where did that book come from? Because that book wasn't there during the lifetime of Imam Abu Hanifa or Imam Ghazali or Imam Bukhari and so forth. So where did this book come from? And because this book might have been printed in the last decade, if we're lucky, maybe a century ago, but it wasn't from their lifetime. And so ultimately, when we look at the book in these sort of footnotes and in the introduction, if it has any, we'll find out that it comes from a manuscript or a series of manuscripts, that it was copied from other sources and then presented to us. So what we're receiving is something that was transmitted over the centuries in physical format, in manuscript form, that was now then sort of taken, edited, and printed and published by various people today. So the truth of the matter is that the bulk of Muslim writings from the beginning of Islam in the 7th century to the 19th century, which is when printing came along, were in the form of manuscripts. So if you want to access our turath, our scholarly traditions, our histories, the bulk of it, if you take around 15 centuries of the history of Islam, 12 centuries, 13 centuries of it, all comes to us in the form of manuscripts. So this is why it is so important for us to know what these manuscripts are, because they are our link. They are the physical manifestation of what scholars in the past wrote and thought about various subjects. And without access to them, we have no ability to, even at some level, to practice the very basics of Islam. If we don't have access to the books of Imam Abu Hanifa or Imam Bukhari and so forth, we wouldn't be able to hold alive our practice of Islam as a complete religion, as a tradition. And so as Muslims, we tend to sort of foreground the preservation of the Quran, which is divine, comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and which is in an oral basis, it's memorized. But we sometimes forget that the rest of the religious sciences, the ulum, all of them have to be preserved as well, for us to be able to sort of understand to the most complete form what earlier Muslim scholars thought about Islam and what they wrote, and to access their opinions. And so this is why in many senses, manuscripts are the reason why we can practice our Islam today, and we can know with some confidence that we're practicing upon a correct jurisprudence or correct theology or correct sense of grammar or tafsir and so forth. And then someone might raise the question, though, that, for instance, the picture I have right now is a manuscript of the Quran, which was from I found in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, and it is from Surah Bani Israel, Surah Al-Isra. Someone might ask that, we have copies now of Islamic manuscripts, of Islamic books. We can read Surah Bani Israel on our phones. We can listen to it in our cars. Do manuscripts really still have any importance for us? Because we have access to them now in other formats. And the truth is that each individual manuscript has a story to tell. So every manuscript, every physical compilation of a text has its own history, and that itself can hold clues for historians or for scholars who are interested in knowing more about the history of Islamic civilization. And so when you look at whether it's the binding, the material structure, whether it's the binding, the pages, the ink, and that all falls under the realm of the science of codicology, or it's the written content, what the scribe wrote in it, which falls under the science of paleography. All of that forms a source of evidence, a source of understanding more about how Muslims in the past understood these texts and how they interacted with them. And so it can tell us, for instance, if you look at this manuscript here, it's very well done, it's polished, there's gold and purple inlays, there's a very complex and ornate dimension, sort of layout to it, and it can tell you that this was a text that was important, this was very valuable, this was treasured, this might have belonged to some elite person, some ruler, or some other person of that stature. And so it can tell you how people are interacting with specific texts and how important those texts were for people in the past. So all of these clues, every single manuscript that we have that survives forms a window into the past. And we'll get more concrete examples of this later on as to how these things sort of surface in our examination. And so, just to wrap up then, manuscripts, formed sort of the physical evidence, the physical link that connects us to the scholars of the past, and they also are windows of insight, of evidence into how these texts were constructed and understood and interacted with, and how important they were for Muslims in history. So, before we proceed, just on a more technical level, just to understand what we mean when we talk about manuscripts, we have to sort of begin with a definition of manuscripts. And I'm just curious, does anyone here want to venture a definition of a manuscript and what that is? Any ideas that come to mind? Yes, a script written by a person that holds evidence. Yes, that's very much on track. Yes.
Kind of relating to what she said, like I actually wasn't even sure what a manuscript was. I think it's just like written, like it's like a document written by a person.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Yeah. So the most simple definition of a manuscript is anything that is copied or produced by hand. And what that means, what that does, is that it sets apart anything that is printed from manuscripts. So manuscripts cannot be printed, and books is usually the term used for printed material. So a manuscript is anything that is written by hand. And generally, manuscripts aren't just like fragments, but they have a structure, a coherent binding, which is called a codex. This basically is a gathering of leaves, of folios, which is a term for the pages of a manuscript. And so the codex is basically the prototype of a book. The old form of a book used to be before the emergence of print. And here you can see a picture of a codex. You can see here how they're layered, how each page is layered. And so that forms the sort of manuscript codex over here. And this is a picture of a very ancient Quran from the 8th century, the 9th century. It's one of the Osmani manuscripts, are as it's known for being an Osmani manuscript, and it's located currently in Tashkent in Uzbekistan. And so, if anyone goes there, you can actually go and visit it in the museum over there. Yeah, and so there are multiple ways in which people wrote on multiple sort of forms of manuscripts. The earliest one is papyrus, and that emerges from a plant in Egypt near the Nile, and people would take stalks of that plant, sort of dry them out, patch them together, and sort of write on them. And it was prevalent from around like 3000 BCE, so before the Common Era, and sort of present around the Mediterranean region. And so there are some Islamic materials in papyrus as well. However, it wasn't that easy to sort of, it wasn't that long lasting. It didn't endure, survive as well, and it could not be folded. So it could not really form a codex or a structure, a coherent structure, a strong structure. And so people began to resort to parchment. And what is parchment? Parchment is produced from the skin of an animal, often goat, sheep, even gazelle. And what they do is they take out the skin, they remove the flesh and the hair, they stretch it, they dry it, they put it through some processes, and then they can write on it. And it's not tanned like leather is. So this parchment is very durable, it's very long lasting, and it was used in the first 2 centuries, so from the 8th century to the 10th century of Islam, very heavily for Quran, for writing mushafs of the Quran and Hadith, because it was very strong and expensive material. And people estimate that to produce one mushaf, one complete mushaf, would require slaughtering at least 200 to 300 sheep and using their skin to produce one copy of the Quran. And so that can tell you that it was very expensive, very limited. So, when sometimes we think about the early period of Islam, that is a reason why we find less manuscript evidence, less things that survive from there, because producing these parchments wasn't easy. It would take lots of labor. It was expensive. It required slaughtering lots of animals, and it was sort of available only on a limited function. And something to think about when we, open our phones and scroll to the Quran and see how like mind-numbingly easy it is for us to access. But people in the past would have to, resort to such expensive materials and laborious processes to achieve that kind of physical access to the Quran. Uh, and so papyrus and parchment were sort of prevalent in the 8th century, from the beginning of the Islamic period to around the 10th century. But they were superseded to a large degree by the emergence of paper. And so you see a picture of a paper over here. What is paper? Paper consists of fibers that have been extracted from rags of cotton or linen or rope, or raw sources such as, and it requires a cleaning, washing, and then produce the sort of lining of the form of the paper. And so one of the centers of paper production historically used to be Samarkand. And if you go visit today, they actually have a paper mill, which shows the historical process of production of this paper. And so what we see here on the left side of the picture is a sort of a bucket filled with branches of a mulberry tree. And so you see this very thin stalks, very thin branches from the mulberry tree, make it easy to extract the bark from it, and then to sort of retain the inner stem, the inner structure of the branches. So they're taken from there, their skin, connected, off, break very, very easily. After oil, our this process is powered by water. So you have a stream here that's propelling pieces. So this was supposed to be a video of, you basically see this wooden structure here. It goes up and down repeatedly. It's a very laborious process, powered historically by water power to pulp, put it into a vat of water, and there it's very, very fine. It's almost like dissolving into the water, very fine particles. And then you see the person's hand over here. He's carrying a sieve. Uh, this sieve basically collects the water, and then it lets the water drain away while keeping the particles of the paper of the mulberry tree. And so once the papers sort of collect together, he can remove that thin film which emerges, and then stack it up over here against each other, against another sort of firm piece of paper. And once they stack it up, once they get like a collection of 100 to 150 sheets, they'll press it down with some very, very heavy stones and reduce the size of the papers to like maybe a third or two-thirds of the original stacking. And what this does, it will compress the paper structures, the fibers, and it will drain also the water. Uh, long process by which paper is produced, and it could be from the tree bark, from like the mulberry tree, or it could be from rags of linen and cotton and so forth. And this was the technique that emerged. And so if you go there, they actually give you samples of that paper. And so this is a sample of the sort of Samarkandi paper that's produced. And I can pass it around for people to follow. See, if you see that paper, it's very strong, it's very sturdy. It will last hundreds of years with no problem. And so just some historical background about emergence of paper. So paper first entered paper was sort of invented in Chinese territories for many centuries, but it passed into Muslim hands in the mid 8th century. So there's a famous battle of Talas between the Abbasid army and the Chinese army of the Tang Empire, and which was held in Central Asia near Samarkand. And in that battle, the Muslim force was very victorious. They took lots of prisoners, amongst them Chinese paper makers. And so the sort of accounts go that these Chinese paper makers taught Muslims how to produce paper. And from there, it spread throughout the Muslim world, very rapidly. So you see the first paper mill being formed in Baghdad, and a lot of these paper mills had to be powered by water, so they were dependent on this water technology, because in order to beat the pulp into a proper structure. And so from Baghdad, it spreads to Damascus, to Egypt, to North Africa and Fez, to Andalusia, to Muslim Spain. And from Muslim Spain, it enters Europe. And you could see the spread of it into different European cities. And there are accounts that, like for instance, Fez during the 12th century had around 400 paper mills in the city. It was a huge trade for people to produce this paper, to sell it. It was an entire industry unto itself. Yeah. And so, because these papers are being produced in different regions, in different areas, each region sort of created its own distinct flavor of paper making. And so when we look at these papers today, we can look at those features and sort of try to identify where it originated. Did it come from Europe? Did it come from the Middle East? Did it come from Persia? Did it come from India? And so forth. And that becomes a clue into how we can understand that manuscript itself. So this is a picture of a manuscript of a paper. And I want you to look at not at the black text, but at the paper sort of beneath it. It's held under the light. And so what you see here are different lines that are crisscrossing the paper. There are some vertical lines. There's technical terms for all of these vertical lines. There's horizontal lines. And the arrangement of these lines would come from the mold that was used to produce the paper, the fitting that was used to make the paper. And those molds were sort of can be tied down to specific regions. So if they follow a specific pattern of these lines, you can try to tell which region it came from just based on how these lines surface. And you also see here some writing, and that is what's called a watermark. And so this was a uniquely European phenomenon for the most part. European paper makers would, in the mold that they had, would leave a watermark, which could be used to identify the source of the paper, sometimes the year of its production, the company, and so forth. And so that also becomes a source of understanding where the paper came from and where the manuscript was produced. For the most part, though, Muslim print houses did not have watermarks. And so with the emergence of paper during this time, we have the rise of libraries with it. And you see, the emergence of Bayt al-Hikmah in the Abbasid Empire, the Mustansiriya library, which is another famous library. And this is the era when you have the crystallization of the four madhabs. You have the compilation of the hadith books, the canonical hadith compilations, so forth. This is a hugely important period of time. And it happens exactly during that time when paper is more prevalent. So it's easier for people to write, to access books. It's cheaper for them to sort of have access to these libraries and so forth. So it goes hand in hand with the explosion of knowledge that happens during these centuries. And so it continues onwards, of course, to the 19th century. And so most surviving manuscripts that we have are from this period itself, from the 14th to the 19th century. And many people, this goes to sort of negate one idea that many people have, which is a decline of the Muslim world from the 14th, 15th century onwards, from the 16th century onwards. People see it as a period of intellectual stagnation, that nothing was going on, that Europe was in the rise, world, the age of exploration and so forth. But paper in sort of knowledge was being produced consistently throughout this period. And so what you see here is a picture of a map of Medina, the historical city of Medina from the 20th century, before all the major recent expansions. And it contains a list of around, I believe, 57 libraries that are located in the city of Medina alone. Some of these were endowed libraries, some of these were sort of imperial libraries, some of these were private libraries, some of these were libraries attached to a masjid or to a Sufi center, and so forth. So the culture of reading and writing and printing was, strong throughout this period. And one other thing to mention in this time is that when the Ottomans came to Istanbul, when they conquered Istanbul in 1453, they established the first print mills in that city. And they also began to establish an official sort of role for a librarian in their empire, so with the fixed salaries. So they had positions of a librarian, of an assistant librarian, a cataloger, of a bookbinder, and so forth. So Muslims were developing these structures of knowledge, of librarianship in this period. And so with this, we can, we discussed a lot of the physical features of a manuscript. We can go to discuss some of the textual features of a manuscript, just to give you a glimpse of what these actually look like. And so what we see here is one manuscript, which I found in Sindh, in Karachi today. And this is a book of a compilation of hadith transmissions that was attributed to a 17th century scholar in Medina. Which was by Ibrahim al-Qurani, a famous scholar of hadith in Medina. And you can see now the fact that this manuscript is found in Sindh today, in Karachi, is an evidence that he was being read. The 17th century scholar from Medina, originally from Kurdistan, was being read by people in Karachi, in Sindh, at that time period. And so what you see here is a title page. The first picture on the left is a title page. You can see here the title in red, Al-Amam li'iqad al-Himam. And then you see here a triangular format where a person goes and writes down the name of the author. And you see certain stamps. And these are stamps of endowments, of ownership. One of the inscriptions here is talking about ownership. This entered, the property of so-and-so person in this state. Another writing here is about, this was endowed to a certain person. And other inscriptions about narration, about getting ijazas or transmitting this text. So you see here all these writings that people have made over the centuries for this manuscript. And that contains its own history unto itself about how this book was being read and understood and how people are interacting with it during this time period. And then if you go on to the next page, you have the first page. You can see here the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim in sort of at the top. Then you have the main text of the book. And then you have all these writings on the side, which are called Marginalia. They could be written by the original scribe. They could be written by others. They could be showing evidence of interaction with these texts. There could be, sometimes you can find opposing arguments in these Marginalia written by people who came later. You can find little notes. So you see here lots of death dates that can help scholars identify, like, the names and when people died and so forth. So this is like evidence of, a living interaction with a specific piece of paper. And nowadays, when in this culture of PDFs and the digital age, we're just scrolling and scrolling through. We sometimes forget that we actually have to do physical work of printing out a text, making notes on it, and really digesting its contents. And then this, the last picture here on the right, shows the end of the manuscript. This triangular format here is a very typical format for what's called a colophon. This basically tells you the details of when the manuscript was written or copied, and who copied it, in which date, which time frame, and any other remarks that they make. So that helps people. These are the main features, and they help people sort of date the manuscript and understand under what circumstances it was produced. And then you find also other, interesting types of commentary. Sometimes you might find a story. So I remember this one manuscript I recently saw had a whole story that the copyist had appended upon about how he took this manuscript with him from a remote town in Anatolia for Hajj with him, and while he was crossing into Egypt across the Red Sea on the boat, the boat was shipwrecked, and how he had to save the manuscripts with great difficulty, and he had to go out and sort of repair it and redo many of its parts and so forth. So you find lots of these interesting evidence of how people interacted with these texts. And so these are some of the textual features that we have of manuscripts. And then, we can, I guess, conclude over here. Yes. For ink? Yeah, so most common ink that was used was something called a carbon ink. It's made from lamp soot and gum arabica, if I remember correctly, so that people would produce recipes of these inks. So a lot of times the scholars are producing their own inks. So they have a lab, they can use it, they can boil it with water, they can add different elements to it, and then they can use that for ink. Yes, yes, they have yeah, red, they have purple, they have lots of different colors, and they're like entire books written. There's manuscripts of those books on how on like recipes, and we can reproduce them today too. So some of them can fade away with water, some of them aren't, don't fade away as much with water. They have different properties depending on how they're made. And those recipes, those like those books detail a lot of those benefits of those inks. Yes, yes, yes. That yeah. So you know so whoever owns the manuscript, whoever has the manuscript in their possession, could add their commentary on it, right? It's not like sort of set in stone. So if someone, like it has over here ownership marks, this entered my possession in this year. So as they're going through the books, they can highlight it. I mean, not highlight it, but they can make their own. They can do the equivalent of highlighting it. They can make marks. They can write things on the sides. Uh, they can, yeah, they can do what they want. But in terms of uh, there's a whole like sort of field of what's called manuscript collation, or sort of understanding if a manuscript was copied correctly from the original source. And so many times, what these manuscripts have is like once the scribe has done copying out an entire manuscript, they'll give it to another person who can compare it against the original. And then once they compare it and they make the changes and the corrections, they'll oftentimes have a note saying this manuscript was compared against the original or another copy, and it was found to be correct uh, in this year and so forth. So there are processes of determining like what part of the text comes from the original author. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So um, I think that would be a different concept. What this is primarily in reference to is the manuscript itself. So, like, when did this manuscript come into my possession, uh, and how did I acquire it? Sometimes they even have the price to pay for it on it. It's less to do with like the constructing a larger family genealogy uh, record. Yeah. So these death dates over here, most probably in reference to people who are mentioned in the text itself. So the text is about hadith scholars and sort of containing chains of transmission from one hadith scholar to another. And so what a person may have added on the sides is the death dates for all of those individual scholars who are listed in the actual text. So these are annotations they make to the original text. Um, yeah. And so, yeah, I just want to conclude by taking us back to where we began from, which is the importance of manuscripts. Manuscripts, are a hugely essential feature of our Islamic civilization, of our history, of our past. They are the ways in which we access our Islamic heritage. And there's a reason why, for instance, when Bosnia was being invaded by the Serbs and the genocide was occurring over there, that the Serbs were targeting the manuscript library in Bosnia and making sure to like bomb it, so to disconnect Muslim Bosnians from their own heritage, from their scholarly past. Uh, and so this these manuscripts, and even a similar story happened in Timbuktu with ISIS in the manuscripts over there. There are attempts when people want to erase people's history, they go first for their historical manuscripts and artifacts and try to wipe that out. Which is why preserving these manuscripts is so important for our community and for our religion in general. And this act of preservation can be, I would argue, can count towards like, preserving our Islamic heritage, or preserving our religion, our ulum, and so forth. And this can take several forms. One is the cataloging, just the basic idea of cataloging. It sounds so like simple and like, like even boring maybe, but the catalog is like the key towards unlocking the entire realm of like manuscript. If you encounter a box of these, manuscripts, very valuable manuscripts, but you have no idea what's in them, it will not really help researchers. And what cataloging is a whole science unto itself that people specialize in, take degrees in, and spend their lives as like full-time workers working with these manuscripts and producing catalogs. So in the last couple of decades, there have been lots of efforts at cataloging Muslim manuscripts throughout the world, from Africa to Eastern Europe to India to Southeast Asia and so forth. And things are moving up. But there's still there might be millions or hundreds of thousands of manuscripts out there that are still waiting to receive their fair share of attention and treatment under scholars today. So this is a huge avenue in which Muslims can sort of contribute and reclaim their own heritage. And another aspect of preservation is also to digitize them after they've been cataloged and make them accessible to Muslims around the world. And for us living here in Southern California, we don't have to go really far to sort of contribute or learn about these efforts. UCLA, which is a university here, contains the second largest collection of Islamic manuscripts in North America, containing around 8,000 to 15,000 Islamic manuscripts in its libraries. They were acquired in the 1960s and 1970s, but they've been left unprocessed, to a large degree uncatalogued, just sort of laying around over there in the university library, special collections, because the university doesn't have the expertise and the funding to support the correct cataloging and processing of these manuscripts. And so this is an area where the Muslim community can step up as well. So if you look at different communities here in Southern California, if you look at the East Asian community, they're huge sponsors and supporters of the UCLA library. They're very active and involved in maintaining their own heritage and their own history. Similarly, if you look at the Jewish community, if you look at the Armenian community, if you look at the European community, they have lots of endowments, they have lots of support coming in to support the history and the archiving of their own, heritage. And so this is an area where the Muslim community can also step in and contribute. And that's our hope for the future, that once we can properly preserve our heritage, we can learn more about our religion and our histories, and have a stronger sense of history and identity, and mastery of our own heritage moving forward. And yeah, I can take any questions now at this point. Yes.
You said that UCLA's collection is the second largest. Was that first?
Princeton.
Also, second question. So at what point does sort of printed copies of these texts become more widely available? Because at first, it's going to be limited to say scholars, right?
Yeah. So print is a whole other subject. I can do a whole another lecture on it. So print emerges in the 19th century in the Islamic world. And what that does is that it makes these books even more widely available. So people have lots of arguments and lots of scholarly debate about the impact of print. But one line of argument is that it makes knowledge more democratic or more accessible. So these manuscripts, these which were to some degree restricted to more literate settings, more elite settings, become more widely available because they're cheaper to produce, easier to print, and so forth. But what's important to remember there is that not everything that is in the manuscript tradition is printed. Only selections from that are printed. Whatever the printer thought was important to them, their own interests. And that has its own effect in reshaping how we think about our tradition, because there are lots of important things that are in the manuscript form that haven't been printed yet, and that need that special scholarly attention to edited and printed, compared against other manuscripts, and so forth. So what we have today in printed format is just a section of the wider heritage and wider history of Muslim writings throughout its 14th centuries. Yes. Alaikum salam.
Emperor Tang, or Tong, but it's T-A-N-G, was the one that gave Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the okay to practice Islam in China. And with that being said, we all know how China was closed off to the rest of the globe for so long. Are there manuscripts in China that nobody has ever seen and want to get to?
Do you mean manuscripts related to Islam or just? That's a good question. If there are, I would imagine they're from the more recent period. So there's lots of manuscripts from the Uyghur community, right, in eastern Turkestan, which is under the rule of China now in Xinjiang, and those materials are also under the threat of extinction, of destruction because of the current the Chinese regime today against the Uyghurs. But as far as earlier Chinese manuscripts in China relating to Islam, I would think there's a very small chance of there being like a substantial amount. Yes.
So when you mentioned ISIS, was ISIS trying to preserve manuscripts?
No, so according to the sort of political commentary, ISIS was trying to destroy the manuscripts because they thought it was filled with heretical knowledge and un-Islamic knowledge and so forth. Yes. Sorry? Oh, for ISIS? I think that would be up to the sort of doctrine of ISIS. It could be, I mean, it could be a wide number of things, but to be honest, I really don't know to what extent they actually looked at which manuscript it is, um, as opposed to just like a wholesale, you know, restriction. Yes.
Read or heard before about a West African brother who was a prince and a scholar, and he was enslaved and brought here to America, and he wrote the first Islamic manuscript here in America.
Yes. Sure. So that was Omar bin Said. He was a West African scholar who was enslaved around, I believe, 1804 or 1805. He was kidnapped then and brought to America, where he ended up in South Carolina under the vicious, very harsh slave owner. And so he fled from over there. He went to a church. He tried to find refuge over there, but he was caught again and sent to another slave owner. And this person recognized his stature as a scholar, as someone who was literate, who could write. And so it seems like he was apparently like more, he treated him better. So he stayed with him for the rest of his life. And so Umar bin Said, by the way, who was around 25 years old and who had undergone lots of training in West Africa before he was captured as a slave, then continued in North Carolina with this particular person, and he continued to write in Arabic as well as in English. And it's interesting if you compare the English and Arabic writings. The English writings are much more sort of Christian in nature because he was, of course, forcibly converted to Christianity during this time. But his Arabic writings contain, their Islamic nature. So he wrote down Surat al-Mulk, he wrote Surat al-Nasr, he wrote other things in Arabic. And so, yeah, these are the first Arabic manuscripts written by Muslims in North America. And they're available today to see, I believe, at the UNC Chapel Hill Library or the Library of Congress as well. And there, you can also download like PDFs online. Again, it goes to a testament of why having these libraries, these institutions is so crucial for us to understand like our heritage, to understand the stories of the past, and to have that evidence, that access to that physical evidence of all these different people who lived before us and who can inspire us and who can shape our own future. Yeah. Yes.
Can you summarize
Yeah, that's a huge topic. So, as far as I've seen, the earliest Quranic manuscripts were produced on parchment, right, which is on animal skin, from the 8th century, 9th century, and they're available in different libraries. In the 1970s, there's a huge discovery of Quranic manuscripts from Yemen in the Grand Mosque of Sana'a, and these, around like 40,000 manuscript fragments were very valuable because they actually had what's really special about parchment, about animal skin, is that you can erase it and write on top of it, and it will retain some evidence of the original within it. So what these scholars have done today is actually to go using like ultraviolet light rays and other kinds of complicated technology is to reconstruct the original uh, writing that was erased and then replaced with a new writing. And so there's been lots of scholarly literature on this and how that compares to the Quran as we know it and so forth. There's the work of Bihnam Sadiqi, who's written a book on this, and he's argued that it shows consistency with the Quran as we've seen it today, as we have it today. So yeah, and then you have Quranic manuscripts that are copied and composed, in paper uh, thereon afterwards. I believe the earliest printed Qurans were actually produced by non-Muslims in Europe, and many of these copies were, I think, from the 16th century, and many of these were rejected by Muslims because they had errors in them, and so they didn't really survive much long. But the first printed Quranic copies, if I remember correctly, came around in the 1870s and 1880s in the Ottoman Empire. Um, and eventually there was the uh, Cairo Mus'haf, which became like the standard sort of Mus'haf, which even till today is like I believe from the 1920s, which forms like the source for the printed Mus'hafs today. Um, yeah. Yes.
Are there accounts of how long it would take for scribes to write these books by hand?
Yeah, that's a good question. As far as I know, as far as I've encountered, when scribes make their own sort of markings towards the end, saying I finished copying this in such and such year, they don't really mention how long it took for them. So I don't have a good idea of that. But what I can say though is that being a scribe was a full-time profession back in the day, and it could also be a hereditary profession. Like you learn it from your parents, pass it on to your children. It was in the family, like a trade, and so it was there was a whole industry of scribes and copyists, and they were crucial to supplying people with paper. And this is also one of the reasons why people say printing came in the 19th century to Muslim lands as opposed to in the 17th or 18th centuries, because scribes had such a vast hold on the industry of paper and book production, and that they would be threatened by printing. Because yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Yes. Blockchain NFTs. Yeah, that's fascinating. It'd be interesting, but to get to that level, you'd have to identify which manuscript it is. Because without cataloging, right, the basic idea is that if you take pictures of a manuscript and you don't have any cataloging, any metadata about it, then it's just pictures on a screen. Like nobody knows what this is, nobody can access it, nobody can Google it, right? So you need to have that accompanying information and data that can allow people to understand like what they're looking at and to find it and to make sense of their of it. So yeah, I'm curious to know though, like what application you would see in making NFTs or out of manuscripts or putting them on the blockchain. Right? Sorry? Right, right. So it could be a way of preserving maybe the transmission of the manuscript, or like showing who had it at one point, ownership or something like that. I don't know. Any other questions? Yes.
So after the battle of lost, what was the Shi rebellion?
The Shi,
Have anything to do with Islam?
the Shi rebellion. You're referring to like the Shi community, or?
I'm not sure. I just seen it when I was looking at battle of lost right now.
Uh huh. I'm. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Yeah. All right, then. There are any other questions? Perhaps we can call it a night. Jazakallah khair. Thank you for attending. I hope this was interesting for you, and I hope you will leave with a sort of more renewed spirit of passion towards manuscripts and their importance and so forth. Yeah. Assalamu alaikum.